September 12, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. 0730 hours. When Sergeant Howard Fleming wheeled the first cart of hot dogs and Coca-Cola into Compound 7, he expected resistance, maybe even refusal. What he witnessed instead would fundamentally challenge everything American intelligence believed about Japanese military indoctrination. The 127 prisoners who had arrived 3 days earlier, men who had been trained to die rather than surrender, who had endured months of starvation on bypassed Pacific islands, broke down weeping at the sight of food their captors considered ordinary. What followed wasn't just a story about sustenance. It was a psychological unraveling that revealed the catastrophic gap between what Japanese soldiers had been promised about American brutality and the reality of their treatment. The hot dogs and Coca-Cola didn't just feed hungry men. They shattered an entire ideology. The transformation had begun 6,000 miles away, in the dense jungles of Bougainville, where Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto had commanded what remained of the Japanese 6th Division's 3rd Battalion. By August 1945, his unit had been reduced from 840 men to 193 survivors, cut off from supply lines since November 1944. They had subsisted on tree bark, insects, and whatever could be foraged from a jungle that offered little. Yamamoto had been educated at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, where instructors had dedicated extensive time to preparing officers for the possibility of capture. The curriculum, documented in captured training manuals recovered by Allied intelligence, painted a specific picture of what awaited Japanese soldiers who fell into American hands. According to official instruction materials from 1943, American forces would torture prisoners for information before execution. The manuals claimed that surrender meant dishonor followed by death, that American soldiers took no prisoners except for intelligence purposes, and that those kept alive would face systematic brutality. These weren't casual warnings. They represented official military doctrine, reinforced through years of training and supported by carefully curated propaganda. Japanese soldiers carried small instruction booklets, examples of which are preserved in the National Archives, that provided explicit guidance. Death in battle was preferable to capture, suicide was honorable when capture became inevitable, and Americans showed no mercy to prisoners. When Allied forces finally encircled Yamamoto's position on August 17, 1945, 2 days after Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement, the lieutenant faced an impossible decision. His men were starving, diseased, and unable to continue fighting. But surrender contradicted everything he had been taught across 15 years of military service. The surrender itself, documented in the after-action report of Major General Robert Griswold commanding the 14 Corps, occurred in stages. First, Australian scouts made contact and assured safe passage. Then, American intelligence officers, including Captain Donald Richardson of the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, negotiated terms. Finally, on August 19 at 1,420 hours, Yamamoto led 127 survivors, all that remained of his battalion, out of the jungle and into American custody. What happened next would be documented extensively by military psychologists, intelligence officers, and the prisoners themselves in testimonies that would later prove invaluable for understanding the collapse of Japanese military morale. The men who emerged from the jungle that day were skeletal. Medical examinations conducted by Navy doctors at the initial processing station revealed that the average prisoner weighed 98 pounds, down from a healthy average of 145 pounds. 70% showed signs of advanced malnutrition, 65% had tropical diseases including malaria and dysentery, and 40% required immediate hospitalization. But the physical condition, severe as it was, represented only part of their state. The psychological preparation for capture had created expectations that made the reality of American treatment incomprehensible. Captain Richardson, who had spent 3 years studying Japanese military culture and spoke fluent Japanese, noted in his intelligence report that the prisoners appeared more terrified of their treatment as POWs than they had been of combat. They expected brutality, torture, and execution. They had been trained to believe that Americans were barbarians who would violate every principle of civilized warfare. The initial processing at Bougainville's forward POW facility did little to change these expectations. The prisoners were deloused, given medical examinations, and provided basic rations, hardtack biscuits and canned vegetables. Standard procedure, but nothing that contradicted their training about American intentions. According to facility records, many refused food initially, believing it was poisoned. Only after guards ate from the same rations did some prisoners cautiously accept sustenance. The transport to the continental United States began on August 28, 1945. The 127 prisoners from Yamamoto's battalion were loaded aboard the USS General William Mitchell, a troopship converted for POW transport, along with 2,340 other Japanese prisoners collected from various Pacific islands. Navy transport records indicate the voyage would take 19 days, arriving at San Francisco on September 16 before rail transport to various POW camps across the American interior. The conditions aboard ship provided the first substantial deviation from what prisoners expected. Rather than being confined in holds or chained, they were assigned to troop compartments similar to those used for American soldiers. 3 meals daily, medical care, and access to deck space for exercise represented treatment that contradicted their training. Navy medical personnel aboard the Mitchell documented that prisoners initially refused to believe this treatment would continue, expecting conditions to deteriorate once the ship reached American waters. Petty Officer James Kowalski, assigned to guard detail on the Mitchell, kept a personal diary now housed in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. His entries from the voyage reveal the gradual shift in prisoner behavior. August 30th, the Japs still won't make eye contact. They line up for meals like they're going to execution. Half of them shake when we hand them food trays. September 3rd, starting to see some of them talking quietly among themselves. One of the interpreters says they can't understand why we're feeding them regular rations. September 8th, a few of them smiled today when the cook served extra portions. Small thing, but first time I've seen any expression besides fear. The voyage created a liminal space where Japanese prisoners existed between their indoctrination and an emerging reality that didn't match. They were being fed adequately, treated for medical conditions, and shown basic human dignity, all of which contradicted years of military training. Yet they remained uncertain whether this represented temporary strategy before inevitable brutality. Lieutenant Yamamoto, interviewed years later by military historians researching POW experiences, described the psychological state during the voyage. We had been taught that Americans were demons who would torture us. But they gave us food, medicine, and treated our wounded. Every day we waited for the deception to end, for the reality we had been promised to emerge. It never did, and that created a different kind of terror, the terror of not knowing what was true. Upon arrival at San Francisco on September 16, prisoners were transferred to a processing facility at Angel Island. Here, more extensive medical examinations occurred, along with initial interrogations by military intelligence. The interrogations, documented in declassified G2 intelligence reports, focused primarily on unit identification and order of battle information rather than the harsh questioning prisoners expected. Intelligence officers noted that many prisoners seemed confused by the professional, non-violent nature of questioning. The rail transport from San Francisco to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin began on September 18. The 127 men from Yamamoto's battalion were assigned to a single train car, guarded by military police but otherwise treated similarly to troop transport. The journey across the American heartland took 4 days, passing through landscapes utterly foreign to men who had spent years in Pacific jungles. According to MP reports, prisoners pressed against windows, staring at the vast agricultural lands, the small towns, the evidence of American industrial capacity that had crushed their nation. They arrived at Camp McCoy on September 22 at 0340 hours, processed through reception, assigned to barracks in Compound 7, and given initial orientation about camp rules and expectations. The compound, designed to hold 500 prisoners, currently housed 340 from various Pacific Island surrenders. Standard Army procedure called for a transition period before integrating new arrivals into the general population, allowing medical staff to ensure no contagious diseases and giving prisoners time to adjust to camp routine. Camp McCoy had been operating as a POW facility since 1943, initially housing German and Italian prisoners before transitioning to Japanese POWs in late 1944. The camp commandant, Colonel Theodore Harrison, had developed specific protocols for Japanese prisoners based on intelligence assessments and previous experience. These protocols, detailed in camp administrative records, recognized that Japanese military culture created unique challenges requiring different approaches than European prisoners. The camp's food service, overseen by Captain Ernest Palmer of the Quartermaster Corps, operated on Army regulations requiring POW rations to match those provided to American troops. This wasn't humanitarian sentiment but legal obligation under the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States had signed and adhered to despite Japan's non-ratification. The regulations specified minimum caloric intake, nutritional balance, and meal frequency that significantly exceeded what Japanese soldiers had received even before being cut off from supply lines. But regulations said nothing about type of food, and this is where Captain Palmer made a decision that would have consequences beyond simple nutrition. On September 21, the day before Yamamoto's group arrived, Palmer submitted a requisition request documented in camp quartermaster files: 500 hot dogs, 50 bottles of Coca-Cola syrup, and associated condiments and serving materials. His stated purpose: special welcome meal for incoming prisoners to demonstrate American standards of treatment. The decision had precedent. Palmer had observed that previous groups of Japanese prisoners showed marked psychological improvement when served recognizably American food rather than generic military rations. His theory, discussed in his written reports to the camp commandant, was that distinctly American food items served a dual purpose, providing adequate nutrition while simultaneously demonstrating the vast gap between Japanese propaganda about American treatment and actual American practice. Sergeant Howard Fleming, who would actually serve the meal, had a different perspective rooted in simpler logic. In an oral history interview conducted in 1987, Fleming explained, "We had hot dogs and Coke because that's what Americans ate. These men had been told we were barbarians, and I figured the best way to prove otherwise was to give them exactly what we'd give our own soldiers. Nothing fancy, nothing special, just normal American food." That was the point. The preparation began at 0600 hours on September 22. Camp kitchens prepared 500 hot dogs according to standard Army recipes, boiled and kept warm in serving trays. The Coca-Cola, mixed from syrup concentrate, filled large dispensers kept chilled in ice. Accompanying items included mustard, ketchup, relish, white bread buns, and potato chips, a complete American-style meal that would have been familiar to any soldier at any stateside base. At 0715 hours, Fleming and his detail of 3 enlisted men loaded the food onto rolling carts and proceeded to Compound 7. The prisoners, who had been roused at 0600 per camp routine, had formed up in the compound yard for morning count. They stood in formation, uncertain of what was coming, prepared for whatever the day would bring based on their training and expectations. Fleming's after-action report, written at Colonel Harrison's request to document the incident, provides the most detailed account of what happened next. At 0730 hours, we entered Compound 7 with food service carts containing hot dogs, Coca-Cola, and accompaniments. Prisoners were in formation, approximately 127 men, appearing nervous and uncertain. Through interpreter Lieutenant Henry Nakamura, I announced that breakfast was ready and invited them to line up for service. Initial response was silence and no movement. Repeated announcement. Still no movement. Finally, Lieutenant Yamamoto stepped forward and, through interpreter, asked if the food was for them. I confirmed affirmative. He then asked what they were required to do to receive it. I responded that they simply needed to line up. No work requirement, no conditions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What happened in the next 17 minutes would be documented by multiple observers and later studied by military psychologists trying to understand the mechanics of ideological collapse. Lieutenant Nakamura, the interpreter, provided the most detailed account in his intelligence report filed on September 24. Lieutenant Yamamoto approached the cart slowly, as if expecting a trap. He looked at the hot dogs, then at Sergeant Fleming, then back at the food. He asked me to confirm again that this was their meal, not a test or punishment. When I confirmed, he picked up one hot dog with visible trembling in his hands. The physical act of taking American food represented more than accepting sustenance. For men indoctrinated to believe that surrender meant death and that American captors were barbaric torturers, the simple hot dog became a symbol of cognitive dissonance so severe it triggered psychological crisis. Yamamoto, according to Nakamura's account, held the hot dog for nearly 30 seconds before taking a bite. Then he stopped, motionless, processing what he was experiencing. Sergeant Fleming's report continues, the Japanese lieutenant took one bite and froze. Just stood there, not chewing, not moving. Then he started chewing slowly, and I saw his face change. Hard to describe, like something inside him broke. His eyes filled with tears and he turned away from his men, shoulders shaking. The interpreter told me he was crying. Within 2 minutes, half the prisoners in line were crying too, some openly sobbing while trying to eat. The reaction spread through the compound like a contagion. As more prisoners received hot dogs and Coca-Cola, more broke down emotionally. Camp guards, accustomed to maintaining professional distance from prisoners, found themselves witnessing a mass psychological event unlike anything in their training or experience. Corporal Vincent Delgado, one of Fleming's assistants, wrote in a letter to his family dated September 25, "I've seen men die, seen them wounded, seen them scared. But I've never seen grown soldiers cry because someone gave them a hot dog. These guys were weeping like children, trying to hide it but unable to stop." The Coca-Cola produced an even more dramatic response. Most of the prisoners had never tasted carbonated beverages, such drinks were virtually unknown in wartime Japan, where resources had been strictly rationed since 1942. The sensation of carbonation, combined with the intense sweetness so different from their usual diet, created a sensory experience that compounded their emotional state. Private Kenneth Yamada, a second-generation Japanese-American serving as auxiliary interpreter, noted in his personal diary, when they tasted the Coke, you could see it on their faces, not just surprise, but this dawning realization that everything they'd been told was a lie. One prisoner told me, if Americans can give this to their enemies, what did we do to deserve our suffering? Lieutenant Yamamoto's breakdown was particularly significant because of his rank and responsibility. As the senior officer among the prisoners, his reaction influenced others who looked to him for behavioral cues. According to Nakamura's report, Yamamoto sat down heavily on the ground after finishing his hot dog, still holding the paper wrapper, and wept openly for several minutes while other prisoners stood uncertainly, unsure whether to comfort their commander or maintain military bearing. At 0752 hours, Yamamoto requested to speak with Colonel Harrison. The commandant arrived at the compound at 0810 hours, accompanied by his executive officer and interpreter staff. Harrison's personal diary, donated to the Army Heritage Center after his death in 1978, records the conversation. The Japanese lieutenant stood at attention, tears still visible on his face, and told me through the interpreter that he wanted to make a statement. He said, "We were told Americans would torture us, starve us, execute us. We were told you were demons without honor. But you have fed us like your own soldiers. You have given us food we do not deserve, food better than what we had before capture. We have been taught lies, and those lies have destroyed us more than any battle." The statement represented more than one officer's personal revelation. It marked the beginning of what military psychologists would later term catastrophic belief revision, the sudden, overwhelming collapse of an entire worldview when confronted with irrefutable contrary evidence. The hot dogs and Coca-Cola weren't magical, they were simply so fundamentally different from what prisoners expected that they couldn't be reconciled with years of indoctrination. Camp medical personnel, alerted to the unusual emotional reactions, arrived to assess whether the prisoners were experiencing some form of medical crisis. Captain Douglas Warner, the camp's chief medical officer, documented in his medical log, examined multiple prisoners showing signs of emotional distress. Physical symptoms included crying, trembling, hyperventilation in several cases, and what appeared to be dissociative episodes in 3 individuals. No indication of food poisoning or allergic reaction. Assessment: acute psychological stress response to cognitive dissonance. Recommend monitoring and supportive care. By 0900 hours, the immediate crisis had subsided, but the psychological impact continued to manifest in ways that surprised camp administrators. Prisoners began asking detailed questions about American food, American life, American society, not for intelligence purposes, but out of genuine bewilderment about a nation they had been taught to despise but which was treating them with unexpected decency. The questions, documented in interpreter reports, revealed the depth of their miseducation. Why do you waste resources on prisoners? Is this food too damaged for American soldiers to eat? When will the real treatment begin? The days following September 22 revealed that the hot dog incident wasn't an isolated breakdown but the trigger for a systematic unraveling of Japanese military indoctrination. Camp administrators, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented, began detailed documentation of prisoner behavior and statements. These records, preserved in National Archives Record Group 389, provide extraordinary insight into the psychological transformation of men who had been prepared to die rather than surrender. September 23 brought the first group request for writing materials. 17 prisoners, including Lieutenant Yamamoto, asked permission to write letters. This seemingly simple request carried profound significance. Japanese military doctrine prohibited POWs from communicating with families, considering surrender such a disgrace that prisoners were officially declared dead. The fact that these men wanted to write home indicated they were rejecting fundamental aspects of their military training. Captain Palmer, the quartermaster officer whose decision to serve hot dogs had catalyzed the transformation, proposed expanding the food program. His memorandum to Colonel Harrison, dated September 24, argued, the psychological impact of familiar American foods exceeds their nutritional value. Recommend continuing varied American menu including items that demonstrate American abundance and differ maximally from Japanese military rations. This serves both humanitarian obligation and intelligence value by encouraging prisoner cooperation. Harrison approved the proposal. Beginning September 25, the camp kitchen introduced rotating menus including hamburgers, apple pie, ice cream, coffee with sugar, and other items that represented typical American fare. The psychological impact continued to deepen. Prisoner statements recorded by interpreters showed evolving understanding of the gap between Japanese propaganda and American reality. Private First Class Kenji Tanaka, a 23-year-old infantry soldier who had surrendered on Bougainville, provided testimony documented in camp intelligence files. In Japan, we were told America was weak, that Americans were soft and couldn't endure hardship. We were told they wasted resources while Japanese spirit would overcome material disadvantage. But they give us food they themselves eat, good food, abundant food. If this is weakness, then strength means nothing. The ice cream service on September 27 produced reactions similar to the initial hot dog incident. Most prisoners had never tasted ice cream, dairy products were rare in Japan, and frozen desserts were luxury items unknown to common soldiers. Camp personnel who witnessed the distribution reported prisoners staring at the ice cream in apparent disbelief before tasting it, then showing visible emotional responses ranging from tears to laughter to stunned silence. Sergeant Fleming, who had become unexpectedly central to the food program, noted in a letter to his wife, "Today we gave them ice cream and I thought we were going to have another crying session like the first day." One young kid took a bite and just started laughing, not happy laughing, but this almost hysterical sound like his brain couldn't process what he was tasting. The interpreter said he kept repeating, "This is what they give prisoners. This is what they give prisoners," over and over. The food program's success led military psychologists to request access to the compound for formal study. Major Dr. William Stratton, an Army psychiatrist assigned to evaluate POW psychological conditions, arrived at Camp McCoy on September 30. His research, published in classified military psychology journals in 1946 and declassified in 1972, provided the first systematic analysis of what he termed ideological collapse through material contradiction. Dr. Stratton's interviews with 47 prisoners revealed consistent patterns. Men described feeling betrayed by their own command, ashamed of believing propaganda, and confused about their identity as soldiers. One prisoner, whose identity was kept confidential in research protocols, told Stratton, "I was ready to die for the Emperor. I would have charged American guns without hesitation. But they gave me a hot dog and Coca-Cola, and I realized my officers had lied about everything. If they lied about Americans being cruel, what else was a lie? Was the Emperor's divinity a lie? Was our holy mission a lie? I don't know who I am anymore." The psychological transformation had practical implications for camp administration. Prisoners who had been expected to maintain hostile non-cooperation instead became remarkably compliant. Disciplinary incidents, typically common in POW facilities during initial months, remained virtually non-existent. Work details, voluntary under Geneva Convention rules, had full participation. Educational programs teaching English and American civics saw enrollment of over 90% of the compound population. Colonel Harrison's weekly reports to the Provost Marshal General's office documented the unprecedented cooperation. His October 5 report stated, "Compound 7 Japanese POWs show highest cooperation levels of any POW group in camp history." Attribute this to combination of factors including adequate food service, respectful treatment, and psychological impact of contrast between expected and actual conditions. Recommend similar food service protocols for other Japanese POW facilities. The recommendation was implemented across the POW camp system. By November 1945, camps housing Japanese prisoners received directives to include recognizably American foods in regular rotation, with particular emphasis on items like hot dogs, hamburgers, and Coca-Cola that represented distinctly American culture. The logistics of this program, documented in Quartermaster Corps records, required significant resources. At peak operations, the system was serving over 50,000 hot dogs weekly to Japanese POW populations across multiple facilities. But the program's value extended beyond morale and cooperation. Intelligence officers discovered that prisoners who had experienced the cognitive dissonance of American treatment became valuable sources of information about Japanese military organization, tactics, and morale. The cooperation wasn't coerced through harsh interrogation but emerged organically from men who felt their previous authorities had betrayed them through systematic deception. By late October 1945, the phenomenon observed at Camp McCoy was being replicated across the American POW system. Camps in Texas, California, Colorado, and other states reported similar psychological transformations when Japanese prisoners received American-style food service. The cumulative effect represented something unprecedented in military history, a mass ideological conversion not through propaganda or coercion, but through the simple act of treating prisoners according to international standards. The implications extended beyond immediate camp management. Military planners preparing for the occupation of Japan recognized that the POW experience provided valuable intelligence about Japanese psychology and potential responses to occupation policies. If soldiers indoctrinated in militaristic nationalism could be transformed by hot dogs and humane treatment, what might be possible with the broader Japanese population? General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo received detailed reports about the POW food programs from the Provost Marshal General's office. Documents from MacArthur's staff files, now available in the MacArthur Memorial Archives, show that occupation planners specifically referenced the POW experience when designing food aid and reconstruction programs for Japan. The logic was straightforward: if material abundance and humane treatment could transform enemy soldiers, similar approaches might facilitate peaceful occupation. Lieutenant Yamamoto, whose breakdown had marked the initial trigger point at Camp McCoy, became an informal liaison between prisoners and camp administration. His role, documented extensively in camp records, evolved from simple translation assistance to active advocacy for educational programs that would help prisoners understand American society and prepare for eventual return to Japan. In a statement recorded on October 15, 1945, Yamamoto explained his motivation: "We Japanese were taught that sacrifice and suffering demonstrated virtue, that material comfort was weakness. but Americans achieved both strength and comfort. They defeated us while eating hot dogs and drinking Coca-Cola. This is not weakness, this is a different kind of strength we never understood. My men need to learn this before they return home, or they will be destroyed by the same lies that brought us to defeat. The educational programs that emerged from Yamamoto's advocacy became models for broader occupation policies. Classes covered American government, economics, agriculture, and industry, not as propaganda, but as practical education about the society that had defeated Japan. The curriculum, preserved in camp administrative files, explicitly used food abundance as a teaching tool, explaining American agricultural productivity, industrial food processing, and distribution systems that could deliver hot dogs and Coca-Cola to POW camps in Wisconsin while simultaneously supporting millions of troops worldwide. Prisoner responses to these programs, documented in camp educational records, showed remarkable engagement. Men who had been trained to despise America now studied American methods with intense focus, recognizing that understanding their conquerors required abandoning previous assumptions. One prisoner's essay, written for an English language class and preserved in camp files, stated, "I thought America was weak because Americans ate well while we suffered. Now I understand, America was strong because Americans ate well. Our suffering did not make us virtuous. It made us weak, and our leaders lied to us about this fundamental truth." The food program's success led to unexpected requests from prisoners. In November 1945, a group of 23 prisoners from Compound 7 formally petitioned Colonel Harrison to allow them to work in the camp kitchen, wanting to learn American cooking methods to bring knowledge home to Japan. The request, though unusual, was approved. The prisoners-turned-kitchen workers learned to prepare hot dogs, hamburgers, and other American foods, while also receiving instruction in food safety, nutrition, and large-scale food service management. This voluntary knowledge transfer represented a complete inversion of expected POW behavior. Men who should have been hostile and non-cooperative instead actively sought to learn from their captors. Kitchen Supervisor Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, who oversaw the prisoner workers, wrote in his duty log, "These Japanese guys are the most dedicated workers I've ever supervised. They take notes on everything, ask questions constantly, and practice recipes in their off time." One of them told the interpreter he wants to open an American-style restaurant in Tokyo after the war. 6 months ago, these men were trying to kill us. Now they're learning to make hamburgers. War is strange. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. December 1945 marked a turning point that would have consequences extending far beyond Camp McCoy's wire fences. The first letters from Japanese POWs, approved by military censors and forwarded through International Red Cross channels, began reaching families in Japan. These letters, copies of which were retained in camp files and later studied by occupation authorities, revealed the depth of psychological transformation that had occurred. The content shocked both American officials and Japanese recipients, though for different reasons. Lieutenant Yamamoto's letter to his wife, dated December 3 and preserved in declassified intelligence files, exemplified the dramatic shift in perspective. "When I surrendered, I believed I had dishonored you and our family forever. I expected torture and death. Instead, the Americans feed us better than our own army fed us even before the war. They give us hot dogs, hamburgers, ice cream, foods I never imagined existed. They treat us with respect and dignity. I have learned that everything our officers told us about the enemy was false. The Americans are not demons. They are simply people with abundance who follow their own laws even when treating prisoners. I am ashamed not of surrendering, but of believing the lies for so long." The letters created unexpected problems for Japanese authorities trying to maintain order during occupation. When families shared letters describing generous American treatment, the information contradicted official wartime propaganda that had portrayed Americans as barbaric. Supreme Commander Allied Powers intelligence reports from January 1946 noted that POW letters were circulating widely in Japanese communities, contributing to reduced resistance to occupation policies. The simple descriptions of hot dogs and Coca-Cola in American prison camps did more to undermine Japanese militarism than any amount of occupation propaganda could have achieved. Back at Camp McCoy, the transformation continued to deepen through winter 1945 to 1946. The prisoners had formed a self-governing council, with Lieutenant Yamamoto as chairman, that worked cooperatively with camp administration on daily operations. Educational programs expanded to include vocational training in agriculture, mechanics, and food service, skills that would be valuable in post-war Japan. The council even requested permission to celebrate American holidays, wanting to understand the culture of their former enemies. The Christmas celebration of 1945 became a milestone documented extensively in camp records and local newspaper coverage. Colonel Harrison approved a special menu including turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie, traditional American Christmas fare. The prisoners, now numbering 340 in Compound 7 after additional transfers, participated enthusiastically. They had learned Christmas carols in English classes and performed them for camp personnel during the evening meal. Staff Sergeant Helen Rodriguez, one of the few female personnel at the camp serving in administrative roles, wrote in her diary, hearing Japanese soldiers sing Silent Night in broken English while eating turkey and pie, "If someone had told me a year ago this would happen, I would have thought them insane. But here we are, former enemies sharing a holiday meal." The hot dog started this, but it's become something much bigger. The psychological research conducted by Dr. Stratton and his team culminated in a comprehensive report submitted to the War Department in January 1946. The report, titled Ideological Transformation Through Material Treatment, a study of Japanese POW psychological responses, documented systematic patterns across multiple camps. The key findings emphasized that humane treatment combined with material abundance created cognitive dissonance severe enough to shatter even deeply ingrained ideological beliefs. The report specifically noted, traditional interrogation and propaganda methods proved far less effective than simply treating prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards while providing distinctly American food items. The contrast between expected brutality and actual generosity created psychological crisis that opened prisoners to fundamental belief revision. The report's recommendations influenced occupation policy significantly. MacArthur's staff incorporated food aid and material assistance as central elements of occupation strategy, reasoning that Japanese civilians would respond similarly to POWs when confronted with American abundance and generosity. The famous school lunch program introduced in occupied Japan, which fed millions of Japanese children, drew directly from the POW camp experience. If hot dogs could transform soldiers, perhaps milk and bread could transform a nation. By February 1946, preparations began for repatriation. The war had been over for 6 months, and Allied authorities were organizing the return of Japanese POWs to their homeland. For the men of Compound 7, repatriation brought mixed emotions documented in final interviews conducted by camp personnel. They were eager to return to families they hadn't seen in years, yet apprehensive about re-entering a society that still clung to the values that had led to catastrophic defeat. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, interviewed on February 14, expressed the dilemma, "I want to go home, but I am a different person now. Japan is still the same defeated nation living in the past. I have eaten hot dogs and learned about American democracy. How do I explain this to my father who still believes the emperor is divine and surrender is unforgivable shame?" The repatriation convoy departed Camp McCoy on March 5, 1946. The 340 prisoners from Compound 7 boarded trains for San Francisco, where they would join thousands of other POWs for transport back to Japan. The farewell scene, documented by camp photographers and local press, showed remarkable warmth between captors and captives. Colonel Harrison personally shook hands with Lieutenant Yamamoto, an act photographed and later published in military publications as evidence of successful POW operations. Yamamoto, speaking through interpreters to assembled press, made a statement preserved in news archives, "We came here as enemies expecting death. We leave as men who understand that our former enemies showed us greater humanity than our own commanders." The hot dogs and Coca-Cola were not just food. They were education and a different way of living. We will carry this knowledge home. The journey to Japan reversed the path taken 7 months earlier, but the men making the voyage were fundamentally different from those who had arrived. Transport ship records indicate that unlike the frightened, uncertain prisoners of September 1945, the returning POWs were confident, educated, and carrying skills and knowledge acquired in captivity. Many had completed English language courses, vocational training, and educational programs about American government and economics. They returned to Japan not as defeated soldiers, but as informal ambassadors of a culture they had been taught to hate but learned to respect. Upon arrival at Yokohama on March 28, 1946, the returning POWs encountered a Japan transformed by 6 months of American occupation. The devastation from strategic bombing was evident everywhere, but so was the massive American aid effort providing food, medicine, and reconstruction assistance. The abundance they had experienced in POW camps was now visible on a national scale, as American supply ships unloaded provisions that dwarfed anything Japan's wartime economy had provided even in peacetime. Supreme Commander Allied Powers reports from April 1946 noted that returning POWs expressed shock at the scale of American generosity toward defeated Japan, recognizing that their personal experience in camps reflected broader American policy. Lieutenant Yamamoto settled in Tokyo and, true to his stated intentions, became an advocate for democratic reform and cultural exchange. His post-war career, documented in Japanese historical records and American occupation files, included work as a translator for occupation authorities, teaching positions at schools implementing American-style education, and eventual involvement in Japanese-American friendship organizations. In a 1952 interview with Stars and Stripes newspaper, Yamamoto reflected on his transformation. "The hot dog at Camp McCoy changed my life more than any battle. It showed me that strength and generosity can coexist, that abundance doesn't create weakness but enables compassion. Everything I've done since returning to Japan has been influenced by that moment when I realized my entire worldview was built on lies." The broader legacy of the POW food programs emerged gradually through the 1950s and 1960s as researchers examined the occupation's success. Multiple factors contributed to Japan's peaceful transformation from militaristic empire to democratic ally, but the humane treatment of POWs played a significant role in shaping post-war attitudes. Veterans who had experienced American camps returned to communities across Japan, sharing stories that contradicted wartime propaganda and facilitated acceptance of occupation reforms. The simple fact that hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers had been well-fed, well-treated, and returned home safely undermined arguments that Western values were incompatible with Japanese culture. American military doctrine incorporated lessons from the POW experience into future operations. Field manuals on POW handling, updated in the late 1940s and 1950s, specifically referenced the psychological value of generous food service and humane treatment. The Korean War and subsequent conflicts saw American forces maintaining high standards for POW care, partly from legal obligation but also from recognition that humane treatment served strategic purposes by encouraging surrenders and facilitating intelligence cooperation. The hot dogs and Coca-Cola at Camp McCoy had demonstrated a principle that would influence military policy for decades: treating prisoners well wasn't just morally right, it was tactically effective. By the 1960s, several veterans of Camp McCoy's Compound 7 had achieved prominence in Japanese society. Business leaders, educators, government officials, and cultural figures who had once wept over hot dogs now advocated for strong Japanese-American relations based on their personal experiences. When President John F. Kennedy visited Japan in 1963, his reception included meetings with former POWs who credited American treatment during captivity with shaping their post-war perspectives. One attendee, speaking to American press, noted, "We were enemies who became students, then friends. It started with a hot dog, but it became something profound, proof that understanding can emerge from generosity even in the midst of war's hatred." 79 years after Sergeant Fleming wheeled that first cart of hot dogs and Coca-Cola into Compound 7, the legacy of that September morning continues to resonate in ways both profound and unexpected. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans maintains an exhibit dedicated to POW operations, featuring artifacts from Camp McCoy including original camp menus, prisoner testimonies, and photographs of the food service programs that transformed enemy soldiers into advocates for peace. Veterans of both sides, in their final years, have contributed oral histories emphasizing the psychological impact of humane treatment and abundant food in breaking down barriers of hatred and ideology. Lieutenant Yamamoto passed away in 1998 at age 84, but not before establishing a foundation supporting Japanese-American cultural exchange with specific emphasis on educational programs for young people. His autobiography, published in Japanese in 1987 and translated to English in 1992, devoted an entire chapter to the hot dog incident at Camp McCoy. The title of that chapter, "The Meal That Changed Everything," captured the simple yet profound truth that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't military but humanitarian. In his final interview before his death, Yamamoto told researchers from Stanford University's Asia-Pacific Research Center, "I commanded men in battle, survived years of jungle warfare, and witnessed the atomic bomb's aftermath. But the moment that defined my life was tasting a hot dog as a prisoner of war and realizing everything I believed was false. That cognitive shock was more powerful than any weapon, and it led to transformation rather than destruction." The psychological mechanisms identified by Dr. Stratton's research team in 1945 to 1946 have been studied extensively by modern researchers examining ideology, belief revision, and the processes by which deeply held convictions can be challenged and changed. Contemporary academic literature on de-radicalization and countering violent extremism frequently references the Camp McCoy experience as a historical example of successful ideological transformation through material contradiction rather than confrontation. The principle remains relevant, showing people through direct experience that their beliefs about enemies are false proofs more effective than arguing against those beliefs. Modern Japanese-American relations, among the strongest bilateral partnerships in the world, rest partly on foundations laid during the occupation period, and the occupation's success was influenced significantly by the POW experience. When veterans organizations from both nations meet annually to commemorate the war's end, they often discuss not the battles but the aftermath, the occupation, and the process by which enemies became allies. The Camp McCoy story appears frequently in these discussions as evidence that even in war's darkest moments, humanity and generosity can plant seeds that blossom into lasting peace. The physical Camp McCoy continues to operate as Fort McCoy, a major Army training installation. Compound 7 no longer exists. The wooden barracks were torn down decades ago, but the site is marked with a memorial plaque installed in 1995 on the 50th anniversary of the war's end. The plaque, dedicated jointly by American veterans organizations and the Japanese government, bears a simple inscription: "On this site, former enemies discovered common humanity through shared meals and mutual respect." May this place remind future generations that understanding can emerge even from conflict's depths. Annual ceremonies at the memorial bring together descendants of both American guards and Japanese prisoners, continuing dialogue started by hot dogs and Coca-Cola 8 decades ago. The broader lesson extends beyond specific historical circumstances. The Camp McCoy experience demonstrates that ideological transformation doesn't require sophisticated propaganda or coercive re-education. Sometimes it requires only the courage to treat enemies with unexpected decency and the wisdom to recognize that material abundance combined with humane treatment can accomplish what force alone cannot. The Japanese soldiers who wept over hot dogs weren't weak, they were responding rationally to evidence that their worldview was fundamentally false. Their tears represented not defeat but the painful birth of understanding. In our current age of persistent conflicts and ideological divisions, the story of Camp McCoy offers hope grounded in historical reality. Enemies can become friends. Hatred can transform into respect. Ideological certainty can yield to evidence-based understanding. These transformations don't require miracles, they require consistency, generosity, and the simple act of treating others with dignity even when circumstances would permit cruelty. The hot dogs and Coca-Cola weren't magical. They were simply concrete evidence that everything the prisoners had been taught about their enemies was false, and that evidence proved more powerful than years of military indoctrination. Today, the few surviving veterans from Camp McCoy's Compound 7 are in their late 90s or have already passed. Their children and grandchildren carry forward the story, ensuring that the lessons learned over hot dogs and Coca-Cola in 1945 Wisconsin aren't forgotten. In Japan, the Camp McCoy experience appears in history textbooks as an example of post-war transformation, teaching new generations that their nation's peaceful democracy emerged partly from the generosity of former enemies who chose humanity over vengeance. In America, the story reminds us that our greatest strength has never been purely military. It has been our capacity to extend abundance and opportunity even to defeated foes, transforming them into partners and allies. The streams of liquid fire that cleared caves at Iwo Jima saved American lives through superior firepower and technological innovation. But the hot dogs and Coca-Cola at Camp McCoy achieved something equally important through a different kind of power, the power of generosity to transform hearts and minds, to break down ideological barriers, and to prove that yesterday's enemies can become tomorrow's friends. Both stories reveal different facets of American strength in World War II, the capacity to achieve total military victory, and the wisdom to win the peace that followed through humane treatment and material abundance that transformed defeated enemies into democratic allies. Lieutenant Yamamoto's tears on September 22, 1945, represented the beginning of that transformation, a moment when ideology collapsed before reality, and understanding began to emerge from war's ruins. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.